The line of the moment is already here, but we're gonna wait maybe 10 minutes because this event is oversubscribed, so there is 90 people who are coming, and they are definitely not 90, but in 10 minutes we'll start. Oh. I am going to beg your indulgence so that we do a proper introduction, because this is our overall series. So in 5 minutes, but before I do that, let's do the housekeeping. If we say run, there's only one staircase. Don't attempt to jump, don't push anyone, just make your way slowly and be out, safe. If you want to go to the ladies or gents, you do the same thing. The building right as you exit, as you go down the staircase right in front of you, you go inside there is the ablution facilities. Those who know how to work out the fire extinguishers, there is one there. There is one behind that side. Me, I'll be out at that time. My name is Dr. Sipositola. I'm a research fellow here at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, which is part of Johannesburg University. We have 4 programs here. We've got what we call the visiting fellows. These are fellows we select from 500 applications from all over the world, and we choose 9. And they are here, those 9 out of 500 applications. From all over the world, they are given 4 months to sit and write. We've got a nice, as you can see, the facility. They've got a bedroom with a writing desk and everything. So all we expect from them is after 4 months, they must give us a product. And then we've got what we call postdoctoral fellows. These are people who have completed their PhDs and they are converting them into a book. And we also keep them here. And then we've got the African Biography Series. These are scholars who are writing on select individuals that are chosen to write biography. As we speak now, we are still waiting for someone to write a biography on Miriam again. We've been trying to talk to Temakizi. We'll see. And then we've got research fellows who are employed by the JIAS who are expected to write and publish. I'm also one of them and also working on a biography. And by the way, this. All of this happens courtesy of Dr. Bongani Mulu. It's an amazing space, creative space, scholar, academic space for us. But let me just then give you 5 minutes to just tell you what we are trying to do with what is happening today. This is our inaugural series. It's called the Jaya's Music Encounters series, Conversations with a Song. It investigates the intersectionality of music and society by inviting key cultural practitioners, scholars, and ethnomusicologists to interrogate certain music genres, the key figures behind the music, and how their positionality are expressed through song. Now, testimony to the statement that the meaning of music is implicated in the meaning of society. This was a statement by a 19th century German philosopher, critic, and scholar, George Simmel, who said the song has always been the carrier of memory, vividly captured by the wandering, inquisitive eye as it witnesses and responds to what goes on in society. And unapologetically, the song, through sound, regurgitates carefully and deliberately constructed melodic messages that harmoniously and rhythmically carry cautious words of sound or sounds of wisdom. And in most cases, these words or sounds are very clear to the intended audience, unless they decide just to dance to the beat instead of listening to the message. And the listener, but are conveniently ignored so that acts of injustice can continue unnoticed. So as an unsolicited civic perception survey, music is used as a symbolic, as a symbol and as a cultural representation through which people interrogate their role and space in society. I must say, though, that some people misuse the mic. They don't understand how that instrument, how the responsibility that one carries with the microphone, that when you speak, you can either build or break society. And when you sing, you can either build or break society. And as Norris said in 1985, the existence of music is potentially threatening to men. This, I'm just saying what it said, but it's gender and what? Neutral. It is potentially threatening to men to the extent that it insists on this social relatedness of female worlds, and as a consequence, implicitly demands that individuals respond. So Conversations with a Song looks at how music observes society from outside looking in and implicates society in the process. And as we gathering today with our first inaugural series about jazz, it also just dawned on me that I actually know of only two genres where people refer to each other as animals. Hip hop, they say dog. And then jazz refer to each other as cats. And I also that Mascandi musicians have also joined the fray. They refer to themselves as this guy, which means a castrated wolf, by the way. And I'm sure gospel musicians will soon polish that along with an E at the end. And the person that is coming here today, who's already here, is a man I've known for such a long time. But just back on this issue of people calling each other, referring as animals, Unduduzo was posted on social media. He refers to jazz cats as either brother this or brother that, if you follow him. And then when he addresses an elderly, he switches to the vernac. And then someone who's older than him, he would say, whether it's American or European or African, Winston Marsalis. Otherwise, if it's someone of his age, you say Brother Hamilton, Delahanda, or Brother McCoy, you know. And it does that just. But as for me, because I don't jazz like that, he just calls me John. And there is something about jazz and jazz artists that you don't find in other genres, and that is its timbre. Listeners are able to distinguish different instruments in the same category or sonic. And jazz allows you to listen to a song in its complete form, meaning you can actually consume the song in its entire wholeness. But you can also pick to choose a certain element in the song individually. And I'm sure those who are older of the same age as me will remember Big John Patton. Yeah, the organist. Yeah. If you remember Big John Patton, there's a song called The Rock. It goes taka 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 ta 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 ta. Then Fred Jackson. Now this individual element in the song then takes over. Then Fred Jackson in his saxophone comes in, and then you remember it says. And then you know, so that's the beauty about jazz. You can listen to the song in its wholesome, or you can listen to certain elements in the song. And by the way, Big John Patton was a Blue Note in 1964. At that time, when you grew up in the township, if you were with Blue Note, you were the cat. And those were assigned to Blue Note, as we know it. But there's also some coolness that carriers of this music are able to wrap the music around, whether it is performativity or representation. And I think Miles Davis actually represents this performativity. Whilst Winston Marsalis has this jazz rat in his presentation. Umas can just turn around and play his trumpet, and that's a whole performance. And we are so mesmerized by just what is just done, you know. Duduzo, on the other hand, Dr. Duduzo Makati, defies all of that. He has carved his own niche, both in play and his dress sense, which maybe in a decade or so we will be able to describe. Right now, I can tell you it is completely shambolic. That is his dress sense, not his play. And today is not about whether to do so. I mean, you know, if you are listening to Sonny Stitt and he calls himself Mr. Bojangles, he wore a suit and two-tone shoes, a shirt and a tie, you know, whether it was Ronnie Scott's, but to do so, you see. And today is not about whether Nduduzo is a multi-award winning musician who has been showing all the jazz cats some flames, or whether he's signed to a prestigious jazz label in the world, Blue Note. We know all of that. It is not about whether he's becoming the most touring jazz artist coming out of this country. And Nduduzo just happened to be passing by as he's here. He just happened to be passing by Johannesburg as he's jetting out to Europe on Saturday for 7 shows in about 4 countries. He just came back 2 weeks ago. So we intercepted him to come and speak to us. I mean, last year, between October and December, he was on 27 shows, Asia, South America, and Europe. This is the son of Noma Jerusalem, a PhD graduate from Stellenbosch University, a scholar, a theorist, a decolonial scholar, a healer. And not his mother, by the way, him. Dr. Nduduzo Makati. Today, you are about to unlearn everything you thought you knew about jazz and the township, its foundation, how it comes about. In true epistemic disobedience and defiance of Western scholarship, or what Walter D. McNaughton calls decolonial option, Nduduzo is deliberately crafting his own niche that is centered on challenging foreign epistemologies that were designed to erase that which we've always known, the cultural practice of our forebears, and how through cultural and collective memory, we are able to redefine how we interpret these sounds of memories. Dr. Makatini is rewriting the form and character of African scholarship by challenging epistemic injustice that has deliberately been crafted to have us abandon our own knowledge system in how we engage about our own ontology and cosmology. His doctoral dissertation, which he obtained from Stellenbosch University, was titled Breaking into Sound, Dislocating into Cosmology and Improvisation in South African Jazz. Dr. Makhathini is a musicologist at the University of KwaZulu-Natal School of the Arts, who has recently published 2 papers with peer-reviewed journals, toward a biography, and Jazz in Post-Colonial South Africa, tracing the politics of formal and informal. Dr. Nduzo Makhathini's scholarship focuses on constructive alternative sites for theorizing jazz studies in South Africa that consider cosmologies as points of departure. And today you will hear terms that we have used daily in your own vernacular speak, but never thought much about what you really mean by what you say. I've known this cat since the days of Native Rhythms, when he was both a co-producer and also a second musician during my amazing productions. Now, please help me welcome Dr. Nduduzo Makhathini as he takes us through Township Jazz, this place and the sounds of remembrance before he just out to Europe. And we are happy to have him. Give him a round of applause.
The leaders can come.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. A couple of weeks ago, well, now it's months, Babu Sword wanted me to present this paper just a day after my graduation. I was traveling from a very long tour, and I was so exhausted, and I kept saying, man, I think I need just 2 or 3 days to rest, but then decided, no, I was gonna do it. And then closer to the time, I realized actually I couldn't. So I think I stretched myself quite a lot between making the submission and everything else I was doing last year. I remember when I was doing my final defense exam, I was in Italy and I started doing my defense from the airport in an Uber. And then of course I got to the hotel eventually, but so I think I quite stretched myself. And also I knew that I was not gonna have time to kind of do this study over a long period. For me, it has always felt like, you know, these processes have always been there, and I was just trying to create a home for them and not realizing that I knew nothing about what I was talking about. So of course that brings me here with a deep level of humility. It's like everyone is like, so after completing this, how do you feel? I'm like, man, I just realized how much I don't know. And I think it's just a beautiful feeling. It's a feeling that you get after a chorus of improvisation as well. So I think it's a thing that really keeps us alive as improvisers, exploring this unknown. But those are some of the things that I'm interested in, but not the topic for this evening. So I sent this topic not even having a line about what I was going to say, but I just thought, wow, this topic is quite something. Township jazz, displaced, and the sounds of remembrance. I was like, wow. Then I had to write the first paragraph, and I'm just going to try and read. If it feels too long, just let me know, and I'll skip some. I'll skip. So the question of jazz has haunted many scholars in the United States and elsewhere for many decades. Even some key practitioners of this art form have denounced the term jazz. While there is this unsettling global question surrounding this term, in South Africa, jazz manifests as a kind of subgenre understood as South African jazz, or sometimes called Township jazz. This further complicates the effort to know, at least in concrete terms, what the term really means. This study builds on various scholarly attempts here in South Africa to establish some understanding towards a definition of the art form, at least pointing to a place, the township, where South African jazz developed. What seems to be clear for this study from the onset is that jazz comes as a result of displacement. It manifests in this moment of wonder, seeking to make sense of home while in a foreign space, a foreign land. In this foreignness, epistemologies are challenged by a setting that creates or produces a form of amnesia that puts to extinction one's cultural practices and rituals. In this moment of the erasure, glimpses of one's memory refuse this epistemicide. And the displaced subject begins to remember the people's song. Of course, there has been various accounts around the project of memory and Atlantic slavery. This project aims at exposing what jazz becomes when considering the very moment of displacement as a signpost to begin thinking critically about the sonic. Here I'm looking distinctly at the township as a site of displacement where jazz in South Africa develops in intimate dialogues with the sounds of home before. Subsequently, this study argues that American jazz became not only an influence to township jazz here in South Africa, but also a sound that triggered some form of relationship with what I term the jazziness or jazziness. Within this jazziness, I submit that some of the sonic characteristics and sensibilities of jazz, as it is known in American jazz, are intrinsically African. Here I meditate on improvisation, polyrhythms, spontaneity, thematic repetition, syncopation, among many other characteristics associated with this music. I then contend that jazziness is much older than jazz itself. It is a place of our collective memory in post-slavery, post-coloniality, post-apartheid. In this sense, I think of township jazz as a process and a sensibility as opposed to a concrete makeup of a singular definition. And here I begin by teasing out some of the ways in which jazz in South Africa dances, I just love that word, with township narratives. In exploring these convergences, we seek to establish township jazz as it's often defined. South African jazz, similar to jazz in the United States of America, enunciates from a level of resistance under a significant repressive social order. By extension, readings of early jazz in South Africa under apartheid depart from challenges of the archive, which complicates our efforts to know. in concrete terms what this music sounded like at the very beginning.
Sure.
Nonetheless, for this section, I am looking at how jazz styles have been defined in intimate proximities with the township. In another study, I have provided a much broader treatment of how these South African jazz styles unfolded chronologically since the 1920s alongside the complexities of apartheid. But I'm not going to try to do that here. So in thinking about township jazz studies, three pioneering texts, arguably the most cited in South African jazz scholarship, come to mind. Christopher Ballantyne's Marabi Nights, Ellie Black, South African Jazz, and the Vaudeville. Prof. David Coplin's In Township Tonight, 2007. Mamko and Answer's Soweto Blues, Jazz, Popular Music, and Politics in South Africa. Just in reading these titles, there's already a kind of pointing towards the township as a site where this music was and is happening. While these studies collectively discuss in significantly compelling ways how jazz became a tool for resistance under apartheid, they seldomly make connections for how jazz might have also connected with memories of place that preceded the invention of the township. Besides some very important mentions, and of course I saw Prof here, so I have to be careful here. There are mentions of how these styles connect to indigenous practices. But for me, this widening gap in this scholarship is of significant interest. But as a point of departure, it is perhaps crucial to discuss at least three major styles that, according to literature today and mentioned above, became products of the township. And these styles are Marabi, Kwela, and Baqanga. And of course, there is a lot of other styles in between. There are also idioms and styles that stem out of these styles. Although these are not entirely the only jazz styles, it is true that these three are among key idioms discussed under the rubric of township or South African jazz, and sometimes even used interchangeably, which has been a very difficult thing to deal with. First, the manifestation of what is now known as Amarabi came out in the late 1920s in South Africa. The term Marabi is derived from the Basotho slang Lirabi to describe a gangster. The term, of course, is indicative of the township that had been known as a site for lawlessness. And due to some people's pursuits of livelihood, on the contrary, this style of music provided an escape from complex realities of exclusion under apartheid. As Dlamini notes, the expressions of Marabi music were symbolic of Africans' cultural alienation from the industrial and urbanizing processes of which they were intrinsically a part. According to Coplin, Marabi can be understood as a and I quote, pan-ethnic, urban African working class style of music developed in Johannesburg during the 1920s and 30s, but the same term also denotes the dance occasions where this music was performed. Essentially, Marabi can be interpreted in varied ways: a social occasion, a social category, a dance, as well as music. As a result, Marabi possessed varied regional enunciations, such as Indunduma, Thulandivile, Famo, and Facho. Prof, thank you for these. I don't really know how to differentiate them, but maybe it's a conversation for another time. These depended on who performed and in which part of the country. Of course, this was now these kind of dialogics between this music scene at the time as a thing that came from the US and people seeking their own interpretations of the sound. Although the earliest of many the earliest manifestations of Marabi music were not recorded in their original form as a primary keyboard style, some of its musical characteristics are similar to most Township jazz styles that followed a simple 1-4-5 chord sequence. It is not far-fetched to locate this chord sequence in Western hymnal music styles or even American jazz that influenced South African musicians via the church. This could also be read as the most basic natural response that musicians in South Africa formulated in their initial encounter with Western classical instruments that resulted into a kind of syncretism. But the interest of this study is in the invocation of the past in the South African jazz practices. As Peter Motwandela recalls, that Marabi was, and I quote, a modification of traditional music's songs which our fathers sang in rural homelands before they came to Joburg. And of course, derived from Marabi, followed a second manifestation, which was Kwela music. And I'm tempted not to go on and on with what these characteristics of these styles are. And of course, this would lead eventually to what we understand today as umbhaqanga. In the reading of this study, Township jazz is a musical style that seeks to remember a music from another place, a time before in the moment of displacement. Here then, I want to suggest that Township jazz cannot be read outside of its entanglement to issues of mobility in South Africa, such as the 1913 Land Act, the 1950 Group Areas Act, leading to forced removals under the apartheid regime. These moments challenge Black subjects, as Coplin notes that around the 1970s, Black performers were confined to play only in the township halls, which, as Babu Jonas Gwangwa recalls, jazz had become a soundtrack for criminal gangs. This made it extremely unsafe for both the artists and audiences to gather around the Black Sonic. And of course, this is these moments of displacement. In American jazz studies, it is already known that jazz postulate notions of displacement, specifically when read within its transatlantic and slave trade narratives. Meanwhile, local forms of displacement are not yet an obvious lens that we use to read South African jazz in its formations in the township. Various authors such as Dlamini, Muller, Washington, Foss, and maybe myself, among others, have engaged the question of exile, maybe exile as a form of displacement that saw musicians from different townships flee South Africa and developing iterations of township jazz in London, Sweden, Switzerland, Angola, Botswana, and in the United States of America, among many other places. But these texts dealing with exile have not dealt directly, or at least not at length, with the issues of local forms of displacement, produced by the Land Areas Acts and Group Areas Acts under the apartheid regime, and how that acts or those informed an articulation of this style. Perhaps the Sonic might be a place to locate some narratives on local displacements. For instance, Masegela, Ngawana, among other artists, invoke this issue of migrant labor in their music, not as a form of instructed displacement, but as a displacement that comes out of disparity and the need to work for one's family. Here, of course, I'm thinking about Masayela Stimela and Bombela as indicators to these mobilities of no choice. And Ngawana as well, Amakoduga, the migrant workers, points towards complexities of life away from home in the hostels. And Joambe reminds us that migrant labor was a systematic tool that coloniality and apartheid used through cheap labor to facilitate white interests while creating dysfunctionality in a Black home. While this project succeeded in various ways, it did not in others, as most of secular migrants kept strong ties with home. For instance, while working in the mines, in the cities, and the migrant, they will refer to their rural home place as a significant locus of sentiment and meaning for self-identity and identity. On the one hand, this thinking in the moment of displacement, this awareness signals a deep connection that people in South Africa have with place. On the other hand, the history of apartheid and its ability to displace does complicate the idea of belonging in South Africa. This complexity is perhaps explained in Swart, who contends that the sense in which, and I quote, the sense in which township youth experience belonging to South African society was through their exclusion from it.
Sure.
This exclusion animates itself in the level of lack of employment opportunities, healthcare, education, land, among other things. By extension, the material challenges produce emotional difficulties such as hopelessness and lack of dignity. So this exclusion cripples the ability to participate meaningfully in the realms of citizenship and those of belonging, of course. For the early generations of township dwellers, memory of displacement resulted to a yearning to speak and a need for some kind of expression. Memory then placed belonging elsewhere, a home before. The belonging elsewhere produced a way in which home was then defined and understood. According to Ndwambe, home could be defined as a symbolic place of familiarity, comfort, security, and emotional attachment. Furthermore, this scholarship argues that home represents an emotional space that connects one to childhood, origin, cultural, and ethnic roots. There we go, we got it. The township goes against these characteristics, but instead creates a feeling of temporality, uprootedness, cultural conflicts, among other deep questions of identity. So a question that bothers many people in the township is that of originality.
Sure.
Whether we think of it in the realms of religiosities, epistemology, ontology, linguistics, even musically, this preoccupation with originality leads to conscious and unconscious activation of memory of a place before. Of course, this was less complicated for the earlier generations, whom at the very least could say where home is or was. This reference to home indexed the rural homeland where their umbilical cord were buried. And by extension, these connections were signified in ritual practices. Over time, these connections have evolved, although some elders in the townships still stand by their indigeneity via memory and teachings that they brought with them in these unfortunate moments of displacement. Elsewhere, I have reflected, for instance, on how forced removals in Hara Tsehwa, I hope that's okay, impacted Dabane's musicality as he felt that this moment presented a challenge, a form of cultural displacement. In the following, or in following Dabane's itinerary, we can see how his efforts to stay connected to this heritage would later result to some of the most innovative periods for the art form. And if you think about Malombo and how that is really a refusal in itself to connect with the place from which we are displaced from. So among other means, people in these moments of displacement often invoked these memories through songs, proverbs, and of another time and another place. In the moment of song, they remembered something about themselves that connected them to a past elsewhere. And this is the thing about the township. There's this living here, but projecting your home elsewhere. Linguistically, you'll be somewhere in some place and they will say your origins are elsewhere. So there's this elsewhere that coexists with the now, with the immediate presence. This then would result to, I did skip quite a bit. This is where improvisation comes in. I'm gonna jump anyway. I do it all my life. You guys are always there when I do it. Elsewhere in my sonic interventions, I have engaged the post-colonial remembering in the township as this departing from what is left post the erasure. Here I invoke the symbolism of these burning fires on Mlilweni and those ashes in a song such as Umlota. In Mlilweni, I posit that among other ways of expressing tiredness, anger, and a need for change, South Africans in the township use fire as a tool of demonstrating their emotional states. I also reflect on how sounds during apartheid were often understood or at least read as a backdrop to the burnings. For instance, songs such as Manenberg by Ibrahim became to be understood as an unofficial anthem or a soundtrack to the Soweto uprising. Fast forward to recent times, fees must fall, decolonization of the curriculum, road must fall, demonstrations, and more recently, what was described as the lootings in KwaZulu-Natal. I point towards the urgency for sound, not only to form a backdrop to the recent burnings in South Africa, but to imagine sounds as enunciating from these very burning fires.
Sure.
And given the extremity of inequality in these times and the need to liberate oneself out of colonial echoes and bondages, the sound can no longer operate as a soundtrack to societal matters, but the very instrument that fights against these problems. As an extension to Mlilweni, Umlota then argues that the efforts of our ancestors in fighting against colonialism remain evidence like ashes after a burning fire. It represents the past that have refused the colonial project. And the jazziness resides in these very memories that have refused. As Babunene tells us, he argues that against colonial erasure projects, indigenous systems still hold, especially as it relates to oral traditions. Furthermore, Babunene argues that the existence of generational wisdom in Africa for thousands of years cannot be entirely put to extinction in a period of 400 years, but that's of course a long time. Of coloniality that deems indigenous knowledge systems to be an active paradigm to this day. Here I submit that there is a glimpse of indigenous memories from the homelands that indeed survived displacement and dialogue with the arrivals of American jazz records in South Africa, and particularly in the township. This means that while it is true that early developments of jazz in South Africa departed from musicians imitating their African-American counterparts, their idiosyncratic enunciations, such as Marabi, Kwela, Mbakanga, became a result of how the art form dialogue with folk music memories in South Africa. It is this dialoguing that I'm interested in, as opposed, for instance, to scholarship norms that engage African music as a point of departure for American art forms, but not engage in continuity, such as relationships over time. In their attempts to define South African jazz, Umamusatima Pierre Benjamin speaks about solidarities of rapture, the tearing and the pain for people of color in the United States and in South Africa in the post-war periods. But as Gaita notes, that in scholarly texts, there is a discontinuity or discontinuities that are further propelled by Western schools of music and their inclination that excludes African music studies in Afro-American ones. Similarly, he argues that African music studies tend to limit the scope of African music to the continent, and that there is a fatigue, again, in African studies to investigate African music culture that lives in American art forms. Sure. Elsewhere, I have critiqued jazz programs in South Africa, and funny enough, I wrote an entire paper critiquing UKZN and I got hired. So sometimes it's not so obvious. Elsewhere, I've critiqued jazz programs in South Africa and in South African university and their propensity to ignore the epistemologies of the communities that surround these very institutions. I argue that there are these borders that restrict the circulation of jazz practices between the formal and the informal forms of knowing. From a decolonial register, I have suggested that the university still assumes a singular articulation of truth, and thus delaying the project of pluriversals, even in music studies, and that's what Dr. Stolle referred to earlier on, that this acknowledgement of what exists outside of the institution is not only a project of replacing colonial lands or these very heavy hegemonies of the West, but it's also a way to say we need to have all of these worlds and worldviews visible and dialoguing. Along similar lines, Muller contends that a greater part of South African jazz scholarship, at least at the time of a publication in 2007, tended to read South African jazz from a distorted comparative lens against its American counterpart. One as the master and the other as a Mamians. In this sense, the Americas became a superpower and South Africa as derivative of the master's narrative. And as Muller concludes that while an independent study of South African jazz past has been challenged by the rhetorics of apartheid and that silenced this art form, there is also a difficulty that came with the reluctancy of American jazz scholarship to acknowledge the existence of languages and manifestations of this music that were emerging in other parts of the world. Meanwhile, the practitioners of the art form, both in South Africa and the US, have for a long time acknowledged each other's contributions, irrespective of this robust lack of scholarship behind these collaborations. Here, I'm thinking of seminal collaborations between Mamsatima Pierre Benjamin and Babutuk Ellington. I mean, come on. Babutuk Nichane with Mal Waldron in 1981. Babu Pegim Selegu with Mam Abe Lincoln. In his book, Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz in Revolutionary Times, Robin Kelly reminds us that the borders between African and American musics were further policed by critics, fans, scholars, and even some musicians. These purist narratives produced problematic doubts that questioned as to whether African American musicians were capable of mastering traditional drumming techniques, or if Africans could swing. I mean, come on, or play authentic jazz. Super problematic. Even more, there were questions such as, and I quote, is homegrown jazz in South Africa authentically African? Or it is merely an import foisted upon a people of, or by the American empire, close quote. Against such complex backdrops, cross-Atlantic collaborations continue in recent times as we are witnessing more cross-pollinations between the practitioners of the art form in Africa and those in the diaspora. One significant example, and of course not because I maybe was involved, but one significant example of such continuities was in 2019, was the 2019 reimagining of the South African Jazz Songbook by the Jazz at Lincoln Center with Umhlonishwa Umkhulu Babuwentini, which featured some of the artists such as Ubaba Makhwaya Mkhubada, Sister Ntuli, Mhlambe nami ngangikhona. Not only did this initiative recognize contemporary South African jazz music, but also the early composers of the music. By extension, this moment paid tribute to jazz cultures here in South Africa, and particularly in the townships. This moment received some reviews. There could have been more, perhaps different to the ones that sought to solidify the boundaries between jazz practitioners in the continent and those in the diaspora. It is then not far-fetched to say that the deliberateness of the JALC, the Jazz at Lincoln Center concert, in acknowledging these shared memories, allowed us a possibility to re-articulate the convergences of these transatlantic narratives. In accordance, Kelly also noted that, and I quote, with the growth of transatlantic collaborations and dissemination of culture, we can no longer speak so confidently about jazz as an American art form, close quote. Of course, here I am reminded of concepts such as BAM, and how those concepts challenge such a view, and they suggest a rendering outside of the pale of African contributions towards the art form. And of course, here I respect my elders that came out with the concept of BAM, but I think against this backdrop, it does in a way become problematic when Africa is omitted in this whole creation and the progress and evolution of the art form. This perhaps ushers us back to what Muller had proposed in her paper, that there is an urgency to reframe the conversations between the two places in a more equitable manner by asking how particular challenges in theory and method in the South African case might enable us to constitute a more social just paradigm for jazz studies as a worldview, a worldwide phenomenon, close quote. Here I also suggest that such a reading does not only produce equitable paradigms, but also invokes collective memory. In this sense, there is an opportunity to remember beyond catastrophes that invaded Black histories and disrupted memory. This opens up a world of theorizations that would look into the linkages that the sonic points towards as a kind of call and response between Africa, or in this case, the townships and the diasporas. In seeking to present a response to such a possibility, I depart again from this theorization of an echo. And in bringing this to focus, Muller notes that, and I quote, each acoustic event has the capacity to generate new waves, to locate the event in relationship to a host of resonances heard from another place. Close quotes. Muller proposes that a musical echo as a device to initiate a conversation between parallel histories that allow perspectives and resonances to be resounded across both spectrums. And one might be thinking, what does it have to do with the township? It has to do with the township, as I explained earlier, with regards to displacement. And here I'm trying to locate how displacement, not only in South Africa, has been a very fundamental point of departure for understanding jazz practices. Then I lost my place in the text. Right. You go. We get the as Muller knows that, you got it. And I quote, musical echoes are the oral vestiges of the human voice. Those quotes. It is a disembodied voice. Here we can imagine a voice as finding homes in the bodies, and the inability for this to happen as a form of displacement, and that results into this homelessness. Furthermore, I want to suggest that sounds in themselves cannot enunciate outside of the peculiarity of these body biographies.
Sure.
To return to Muller, when the body, and I quote, when the body is dismembered and suffering inflicted, the voice, quite remarkably, retains its presence and its capacity to bear witness to cruel treatment and bodily disintegration. It presumes the power of final comment. This disembodiment, well, I can't help to think about how that relates to the issue of George Floyd, maybe far from the study, but still revealing of this body and that final comment, and the notion of breathing as something we take lightly, which is a birthright, but that can also be inflicted. This disembodiment of the displacement of is of particular interest in this study. It is already known that apartheid in South Africa was a way of erasing Black cultural memory. In fact, a greater part of the early jazz archive in South Africa was destroyed by the apartheid regime, which deemed this jazz archive to be of no importance. So there are these lost years as we try to read jazz in South Africa. These lost years is something that's difficult to account for. And the regime, well, in cultural identities in South Africa, in this sense, what we hear today is a sound that has refused to really succumb to disembodiment. This sound in the memories of our ancestors as embodied knowledge that got passed on. It is this very refusal that composes the jazziness. It is a way of bringing forth that which we know about our past and allow that to dance with current moments. By this, I mean some relationships with the sonic that is now understood as South African jazz have a much older alliance with the musical sensibilities that were practiced in African music predating slave trade. Here I want to argue that the sonic properties of what we would later understand as jazz carries indigenous sound strategies that can be found to this day in African music, such as improvisation, polyrhythm. In fact, one can go on to locate swing feel in the various African indigenous traditions, as master Nigerian drummer Prince Odog once pointed out that swing, and I quote, was an imitation of native African music. Here one can submit that what manifests as African sound utterances or even jazz departs from some cultural concepts. For instance, Keita deems, and I quote, African cultural values as a formative factor in Afro-American culture, close quotes, and of course, in African-American musics. This unbrokenness of collective memory can be understood as residual strains. Keita understands these residual strains as these traceable shades of echoes, where Africa expresses itself both in Africa and in African-American music. These residual strains then characterize our refusal to be displaced through being rendered different names. We come to become the ashes that refuse burning. In this sense, sound then, or the jazziness, is a way of pointing towards belonging, memory, and sameness. Within this view, then history and the past becomes an active paradigm. In the context of jazz practices, Muller again engages this notion of living histories as a way of looking at how the sound transcends conventional chronology and allows past memories to be animated in dialogue with current ones, and thus affinities between living and the past. In this way, she suggests that present musical moments intrinsically bear remains of the past, involved in a kind of web link. Elsewhere, I explore what I call sonic citations, which is a way to open dialogics between here and what I refer to as an elsewhere, maybe not so related, a way of keeping alive the voices of our ancestors. Within this cosmological paradigm, I suggest that not only is the past a memory that we can recall, but also an active universe where new questions could be asked. This can be applied in the view of Africa post-slave trade, coloniality, and apartheid, that through the sound, there is still a possibility to make recollections and even new connections that tied up in our cosmology. Here I suggest that the jazziness as a collection of African musical memories is older than jazz, which is, I know this is it's gonna take a long time to argue that. I need more than one paper. So the jazziness is much older than jazz, but instead it became the jazziness became the very point of departure for jazz in America. In this spirit, jazz then, both in America and in townships of South Africa, could be understood as a protest against cultural erasure that came with slavery and displacement, and maybe coloniality to be added there. It is then a sound that is a birthright to the ones who are willing to remember the depths of origin beyond these catastrophic moments. As South African pianist, Bob Chris McGregor, once said, and he talks about this jazziness as a thing that's really inherent. When he was in exile, he said this, and I quote, "African jazzmen are developing new and more sincere lines. They have natural advantages denied to musicians in Europe, Germany, France, Scandinavians, who have to first teach themselves to play like Americans." Well, in order to get to play like themselves. Yes. Whereas the musical tradition of African music leads spontaneously and directly into something immediately recognizable as jazz. So what this means is someone who has never had jazz before, this will be a very natural kind of response to an encounter with the piano and what we would call jazz today. So I think I have to skip because also I feel like I've said it.
No.
In this, can I? In this brief study, I am making an invitation to jazz studies in South Africa to think collectively about the kinds of theorizations that exist at our doorstep. I have argued that township jazz in South Africa builds both on African American jazz through inspiration, but also through its own responses and these local responses to our own displacement via memory of what I call the jazziness. I have also submitted that in the moment of displacement, there is a refusal that leaves behind the refusal to leave behind one's indigenousness. This indigenousness in township jazz in South Africa emanates from a kind of folkness that people have practiced even before encounters with the settlers. Thus, while the township may appear as a place that left behind particular traditions, it is simultaneously a place where these traditions have been kept, modified into relational philopraxis. Thank you.
The son of Mama Jerusalem. That's not by the way, the paper that you just had is still in the making. It's going to be in the book.
Yes.
The Township Studies book that is going to come out of this university.
Yes.
And co-edited by Dr. Fenikosi Toniwe, Professor Ntabiseng Motsini, and Dr. Seposto. Professor Copeland is also contributing a chapter in that book. So is Dr. Ali Shomwan is contributing a chapter in this. I'm not sure that you're not contributing. Now we are inspired. Don't you just like this place?
Oh, no.
Yeah. She's a teacher. Of course, I did my introduction, so I'm not going to go back and reflect on what Dr. Nduduzo said, as he's just passing by, going to Europe. You know Ronnie Scott's the jazz club in London. How it came about? How it came about? Ronnie Scott would travel, and then he wanted to have a place when he's passing by London to perform. And then the jazz club actually built that jazz club, which is one of the most prestigious jazz clubs now that we have in the world. If you land in London tomorrow and you try and go and see a show there, forget it. It's sold out for 2 months, unless you call me, I will make it. I am going to take some hands. We still have time. By the way, Dr. Bongani Ngulunga, my boss, was worried because I didn't realize that jazz enthusiasts and scholars like you, the first thing that you do when you walk in, you go straight to the wine. And then she says, "Wine." We need to get 10 more bottles. I don't know whether we succeeded, but we did very well with the wine. Yes, so let's take some hands, please. Yes.
So thank you so much for so there were two big notions in your presentation. One, the notion of exile, and then the notion of displacement. But during the course of your talk, you also stipulated another concept which should be expanded, the notion of syncretism. Right? Now, that suggests that, jazz is not only a sound of remembrance of the past, it's also a hybridity with Western modernity, which complicates the story of epistemic disobedience. in the sense that it's not only saying we are being displaced, we are never in the past, but that we are also combining, or we don't have a choice, really, right? We are placed in Western modernity, and we are going to make something of it. Hence the word secretism, right? So can you say a little bit about that? Right? You know, you've said, really
Sure.
about exile, about displacement.
Sure.
Say a little bit about how, and this is a critique of also decoloniality, right?
Sure.
Which assumes that there is a break. You can delink from Western modernity.
Yeah.
But the best of resistance is resistance that remembers the past, uses Western modernity to make something new.
Yeah.
You can call it secularism, I call it curiosization. Diasporic affinity between South Africa, Black South Africa, and African American is really based on this notion of the Black Atlantic. You are here.
Yeah.
There is no way back to the past.
Yeah.
This decoloniality, I mean, I'm listening to talking critique in the levels. This
Go for it.
can go to equal Africa.
Yeah.
It's nothing like that.
Okay.
Right? So yeah, so can you say a little bit about how just in addition to the re-memory, it's also a synthetic sonic sound.
Yeah. Well, I think there were moments where I actually have spoken about that, even in this very presentation. In fact, when I started, there is a reason for something that I would call an accent. So in these moments of displacement, we see a necessity to accent that which we think represents who we are. And an accent in musical terms is not a way of saying other bits do not exist. An accent is a pronunciation of a particular sound for a particular reason. And our reasons are very obvious of doing what we're doing. So this read against many concepts, decolonial scholarship concepts, such as the invention of Africa, as Mudimbe proposes, that not only we're trying to activate this memory, but also this very memory has been hijacked in the sense that we're still cleaning the memory and inaccuracies of this very memory. So, so the glimpses, and I did mention this word, that this memory I'm talking about is a memory that refuses, it's a fighting memory. I did not suggest in any way that this memory was available and it was sacred, but it's a memory that has managed. So the idea even of the transatlantic and this refusal. So I mean, if you think at the notions, of course, of the global north and global south, and you realize this problem of hegemony. If I walk into an institution today, well, how about this? At Stellenbosch, I had serious challenges with ethics applications. And one of the challenges in this ethics application, and I'm saying it because it's in my dissertation, so I'm not talking behind their back. The challenge of ethics was the very application that was not ethical to me. Yeah. So for instance, there were things that I was proposing, which I deemed to reside with the very construct of my ontology, cosmology, that should be obvious, such as some of these texts will reflect moments where I go and attend a ritual ceremony. And of course, in the ethics application, then the question of, are people going to have consent forms there? So there's a sense in which inside of those ethics application forms, there's this world that doesn't exist. So the invisibilities of these worlds is the very reason, not only for a plurality, but for an accent in African knowledge system.
Thanks so much for a presentation.
Thank you.
I want to segue from what Prof. Madhu was yet saying.
Just raise your voice if you so that they can also hear something.
Sorry. Segueing from what Prof. Madhu was yet saying, I usually agree with much of what he had said. Except for, I don't think decoloniality is only about delinking. I also think it's about creating privileges.
Of course.
So I was thinking about a number of things while you were speaking. And essentially there are three things. Firstly, I don't know, I find it problematic that we talk about township studies in the sense of, like what you were talking about, displacement. I agree that that is the story for a lot of people who find themselves in the place. For other people, they always come from there. They don't come from elsewhere. If I think about Alexandra and I think about Everton, if I just think about Joburg now. This is a place where we had free title to land for Black people. They didn't come from elsewhere and they didn't rent there. They lived there and they owned the place that they lived to, and they were, title was removed from it.
Yeah.
You know? And so how do we make space in township studies for people who have always come from a place where displacement does not make sense for them? The second thing is, thank you for speaking about Maddenberg. Some of this from Cape Town. And when we talk about township jazz, I think we need to make much more space for that in the world. Cape jazz, Vanderbilt jazz, scuba jazz. It's a very important genre of township jazz and jazz. As much as there were migrants from Indonesia and Malaysia that originated there, the unslaved in Cape Town, it is a Cape, it is a South African genre of jazz, and we need to be studying that as township jazz. So that was just one comment I wanted to make, and I think it's very instructive also. Some of the histories that we have about Cape Town and about what slavery looked like from the perspective of the enslaved, from the oppressed, comes from music, not so much from written down narrative.
For sure.
It's actually a source of archive, and we need to take it seriously from that perspective as well. And then the third thing I wanted to say is, and I know this is an old thing, but I think we need to say it again. And I know the term ethnomusicology is problematic, and perhaps we need to talk about African musicology or global South musicology, because it's not any less of a discipline than
or another concept outside of musicological, that language maybe is.
But like it's dominated by people who are not brown and black. And it's highly problematic. And I just wanted to get your sense from how do we actually produce something that is authentic with the current state of affairs, where we are not adequately actually represented in those spaces. So I know I've said a lot, but
it's a lot. Thank you. I mean, it's all very, and I think this, when I started writing my dissertation, I proposed this notion of writing together. And this writing together for me, of course, was in these moments in sound checks and in other ways where conversations became a way of writing, or at least of thinking together. And so I don't feel like that's a lot. I think it informs, even what Prof says, informs the ways I go back to this and we start writing together. Because it's just maybe a matter of words that could be positioned in a particular way, theories that could be used in other ways. And we are constantly looking at these gaps as scholars. So with regards to the notion of the township, I do not necessarily think displacement is irrelevant for anyone that is in the township, given the history. Otherwise, it's the same problem where history does not matter. So it came as a result of displacement. And it's for myself, it's a place that we live in, but we constantly are refusing to own because it's not our construct. And there is something to be said about calling that place home is painful. I am one of those people. So there is something to be said about these cultures as also things that were displaced. So it was not just bodies. And if you talk about someone that's born in the township, I think that limits it to a body. But this body carries within itself these traumas. So what you say about a child that is born there has no reference to this history and become something else in the community. This tells us something else that it's the same thing that I would say to Prof as well about this notion of an abstract universal, this idea of wanting to submit to a universal when you've not crystallized your own. So the universal notion becomes a very abstract notion. So I think this is the same as the township. You know, it's still dysfunctional to this day, and we don't want to own it. We still want to say it's a colonial construct. It is a thing that has put dysfunctionality in a Black home. And we still want to say within that, we are unable to practice things that give us identity, which are cultural. You know, I mean, I'll take a very quick example. I'll take a very quick example during lockdown that I've made, I've referenced this example. When, for instance, regulations that were suggested were social distancing. It again shows that we are invisible. How is social distancing possible in Alex or Emma, where I come from? So you can see that the system continues not to care so much about what Prof is saying about the inclusion and that we coexist. The West seems not to care much about that coexistence. But I think we have this thing where we feel so much for people that do not actually feel anything for us. And I think both these comments for me point again towards this, our natural thing about feeling things that I think we don't have time because we've been ignored. I mean, the fact that you go into a university today and it's still a university. I want to go to a plurivers somewhere. So there is a sense in which the options are not yet available. And we'll continue trying to crystallize our own thing that would be submitted as an option. But I think we don't want to spend time trying to think about this hybridity, although it exists, we're not ignoring it, but there's a necessity. Ours is becoming extinct. I mean, it's going to extinction, our languages. I think we should worry about that. Ngukis are letting us about epistemology, our ways of knowing are being eroded. So hybridity, a very long time, for me at least. Yeah.
I'm looking at this side, but I'm seeing and this side. Mshongo and then Usis. Yes, Miss. There's one hand.
Yes. And so, yeah, Joma.
Makasih, first, congratulations for your work. And perhaps a spontaneous comment would be to you, particularly in the developments you made, and for some of us was anticipated quite sooner than what we saw. I'm just wondering how long you guys are able to keep you, because I see you. So let's not go there. Thank you for what I think you did beautifully with the separation of jazz, the form, the art form, and the stage of jazziness. And if one were to take time really to get into that, spend it much longer. But I want to ask you, perhaps because of time, what is your sense of the current jazziness of our sound?
Yeah.
What do we sound like to you?
Sure.
In terms of the nuance. I mean, we had a beautiful bellowing by Skakana when you walked in. And I'm thinking of the beautiful sound that we have in the generation that we have today, about Chandi, about Dawozu, and the many other voices. To you, what's the state of our jazziness, right?
Sure.
Man, I don't know if I'm the right person to respond to this, but I understand the importance. And I want to then submit my failure in trying to respond to it. And I think one of the things that is becoming very evident with the current jazz practices in South Africa is that there is this yearning for belonging. I mean, you speak about this Tandy, she asked this question of exile and being exiled. Undabo that you mentioned presents us with this notion of umgidi. You know, what these celebrations look like. And of course, we cannot forget Mpoga Khoza in bringing all of that text that is, for me, this is the option. I mean, we can think about many other people. You can think about Kyle Shepard, who is very deliberate about like how Ibrahim's echo should be a part of our consciousness, you know. And then again, I think we'll go back to that hybridity, Prof, when we think about Ibrahim and this hymnology. There is a sense in which we discredit ourselves many times, even within our understanding of cadence, for instance. We seem to attribute a lot of things, including hymnals, to the West. And Agao does warn us about issues of coloniality and how tonality was used as one of the tools. But I think there is another submission that I think Babu Mkhize is working so hard to reveal that actually these modes were always here. So there is this moment, even within the hybridism, we have to account for how much was stolen from us before we enter a hybrid status. We have to first say, how much did you take from us? Then we'll collaborate. So I think there is a sense in which the current jazz scene is very mindful of that. And I think we are thankful to the generations in the 90s of Abu Gloria Bosman, or Babu Zilin Hawana, or Babu Mlelekwa, and all of these people that were really, I mean, Lelekwa was very clear about pointing to the Bapedi systems as a way of articulating his jazziness. So I think there is that kind of consideration made by many musicians, and most of us really grew up in the townships, but we have to locate Amahubo and this Zuluness or the Xhosaness, the Fediness. So I think there is a project now in the jazziness that is so intentional. It's in the packaging, it's in how people speak in interviews. I think this is a very profound moment, and we need more literature to dialogue with this moment. I think literature is behind. And it's a pity because I'm seeing Lucy Sparty, and I once said to her when she was asking, well, I think I want to write. I was like, we need people that write. So there is an urgency that as these questions are being asked and we are responding and we're playing this music, for these things to be also documented.
Sure.
And as I take the next question, there is a register that is going around. If you haven't signed, just make sure that you're willing to proceed. Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask a similar question about the current state of jazz, but I also wanted to make a comment about kind of like the white scholarship of jazz, and whether you kind of have that sense. But I think during your talk, my brother, it was so like obvious that obviously, you know, we have to sort of build on the household names that, you know, we all know that are mostly white scholars. But on the other hand, I really saw, I followed how people, I don't think I've ever seen people being this ecstatic about the wonderful achievement of the PhD, including myself. It's, like I usually freak out like this when you like produce an album or I listen to the song, this kind of thing, right? But I really think that this is that people, and it's just observation, that people that all of us were so ecstatic and so like amazed in a way and in awe, because we like, that's so amazing. It's, you know, the brother Nduduzo now, I think Uyonela, is on his way, to follow you. Etc. So I think that we're building our own scholarship.
Yeah.
And that's amazing, and I'm really just wanting to thank you.
Oh. Well, needless to say, the first time I ever walked into this building, you had invited me to give a keynote address. And to your knowledge, maybe you didn't know, that was the first paper I ever presented. I was so nervous. I was sketching paragraphs just 10 minutes before. I would see someone, I would see like a person about to walk in and sketch a paragraph. I see Copeland walks in, sketch a paragraph. I ended up with this very short text. And luckily on that day, I had the piano, so it was like improvisation. But my text ended up like from so many pages. It was this small. So thank you for giving me that experience and allowing me to know this space. And I'm thankful to you. Yeah.
Talking about having a piano then, so we were in Cape Town just 2 days ago, so I called Reduce, I said, Reduce, now we have over 80 people already and we have RSVP. And I'm not sure whether they are coming to listen to you or they are coming to see you play. So I can't bring a piano from my studio. He says, no. I mean, I've never heard him so assertive because he's a very polite person until he argues. He says, no. I want us to present the silence of jazz. And says, you're not gonna win this right now.
Well, Joey, we have to contextualize. So I've always said, even in my concepts, that like improvisation is impossible. And it's in this very moment when you realize that you failed and you do it anyway. That's when you play this music. So I kind of knew that there is a kind of stereotype maybe that surrounds performance and performance traditions. But also I was just thinking about how difficult it is or how impossible it is for the Black body to actually perform. And I think this involves a scholarship that Umokorosi is venturing in, which is very important, that talks about the politics of the body and how the difficulty of this very construct of performance. So maybe it's a paper that.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's someone online, but I want to just talk about how difficult for the Black body to perform.
Yeah.
So Natalie Cole writes about her father, posthumously, of course. And she tells a story when Nat King Cole, on a very beautiful Sunday summer in the US, gets invited by the neighbors just 2 houses up the road. And he goes there with his family, and Natalie is still young then. So because he's an artist, so they decide to say, oh, Nat, why don't you just play us a song, you know? I mean, perform and sing a song, whatever. He does it on Monday. Small note. By the way, that little performance that I did, that you had requested, here is the invoice. There is a hand, I think it's
Asake. That UJ, at least I know, is not so good with invoice.
I see let me just say someone online, but this is the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study.
Of UJ.
Asake, if you can unmute and then ask your question.
Thank you so much. Mama Katin. Thank you so much for your presentation. For the attendees who are there in present, Mr. Dr. Makatin is performing tomorrow in Bramfontein, so you'll get to see him perform. Yeah, but my question is not really a question, but also a comment. I wanted to understand when you spoke about accents in music,
Yeah.
because most of the time accent is related with text and diction and enunciating oneself. But with this instrument that you play, which does not produce words, how do you accent the different elements from township jazz? And if we are the cradle of humankind in Africa, what sort of influences that played an impact in the music that we play? Because when we look at the concept of jazz and the terminology and the explanation on Google, it says it's Black American music. But African township jazz is locally flavored and grounded within the context of Africa and South Africa. So where does it originate from, and how do you accent that with the piano? Thank you.
Wow. So the issue of accents as it relates to the sonic, it basically the explanation is points of emphasis. So if you're accenting something musically, you are making it even more clearer. And dynamically, those moments will be louder than other moments. So it's a way of vocalizing. So there's a sense in which when a musician plays, there are ideas that are deliberately or intentionally are not meant to be heard. And this is one of the key signifiers of bebop music, where they talk about ghost notes. So they have those ghost notes, but they accent 2 and 4. And 2 and 4 is what would then be called swing, which is, you know, a thing that's there in music in Morocco and all across the continent. But the idea of accenting is really about a thing that allows one to say, in the story that I'm telling, these are the things to take note of. And so musically, I would do the same. And with regards to your issue about jazz as being an American practice, this is what I've tried throughout this paper. This is what I've been trying to say, and how in the matrix of this music, we tend to find things that are indigenously African, which brings us back to Africa as a point of departure. And again, not to ignore other influences, but we're saying from the blues, these were the beginnings. And perhaps when we think about the blues, we're thinking about talking drums and all of those things. Maybe we didn't have any kind of dialoguing with any other art forms at the time. And maybe when it comes to these classical instruments, then we started to dialogue. But also I wonder if I was presented with this Western classical instrument and I had never heard any classical music, if I wouldn't play similar things. So there are issues to really be addressed with regards to responses and how people just naturally respond. I mean, if you hear about Black Moses, I mean, I've never heard anyone sound like that. And he's playing an organ, and no one in the whole world can play anything that he plays. So what do we call that? He's playing a Western classical instrument, but he's playing that accent enough his own identities? So there's a sense in which these accents as well are these things that help us to go around the world because they hear something else. You know, I think it's this something else that is the accent.
I'm gonna take 2 last questions. I've noticed that I don't want you to take them. And after that, I'm gonna tell you some good news. Garabo, you next. Huh?
If you could turn it and point it to the ceiling. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's just that for the.
No, it's okay.
It's just that for the camera, it was appearing dark on the computer. Thank you so much. 2 last questions, then I've got some good news. Yes, ma'am.
Congratulations. Thank you for such an amazing paper. This is the thought and I just like your comments on it. It raised the question for me, has kind of the jazz discursively kind of educated educated itself out of like working class conditions. The reason why I say that, right, is that, I mean, we're having this conversation on top of a hill, on top of a hill, up the stairs.
Yeah.
In a tower, right? But also think about the lines that, because I'm trying to also draw lines between sort of jazz and the discourse about who did jazz, right? So the jazz, the music. And this is personally thinking back to my own childhood, thinking about issues like, you know, Orlando parents are watching who are drunkards and thugs, they're the ones who listen to jazz. Now, when you ask who listens to jazz, you know, how much does the picture come and see you from home, for example? And then you draw those lines between how jazz kind of did social, how jazz was social. And you draw that line between that and piano today, we talk about who's engaging with that music and are they doing similar things or not? You don't have to answer the question, I'm putting it out there for everyone. Otherwise,
Very nice.
Yeah. Well, I really, I think it would really need a very lengthy response. But I can already say that I'm kind of on board with the things that you are raising. It's the very things that are frustrating me as a practitioner of this music, you know, in terms of how it's commodified as well, and how that very process becomes an exclusive process, and then certain people can afford to hear this music, and some do not afford to hear the music. Then also the question of returning again to the townships and how, for instance, difficult it is to put a concert together. It's the work that we need to do. Myself and Scott have been involved in this. He's born on the 30th of December. So we always do something in Tanzania. I visit him there and we set up this festival, but it's logistically, it's not easy to do. But I don't think it's a thing that jazz musicians themselves are not aware of, but it's a thing of trying to figure out this balance of how we can make some money where money can be made and be able to, for instance, in Tanzania, me and Scott fund a thing to go and actually pay for. So I think it's just those kind of dynamics that we are in this transition. We are mindful of our disappearances from where we come from, and we are composing responses.
Sure.
You had your hand. No.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you. Congratulations for the paper. As a meeting. It's a very interesting definition of what intellectuals are. And it's intellectuals are people who study things that people do naturally. But you know, as we were talking, there's something that you touched on, which was bread, and you sort of, and I was actually waiting for you because you were talking about bread, breathing, you know, and it's something that I am very fascinated with.
Yeah,
and it actually comes from Gibson, Canada. You know, there was when we were being in the cast of Gibbs, if somebody maybe doesn't perform right or whatever, and they would just breathing. And when you type on it, I am actually now basically coming from an actor's perspective. And I've come to a conclusion that each and every emotion has got its rhythm of breath. And I think that is something that I think it has somehow, it's like deep into that. And just because we have this thing all the time of saying, you don't want to get into character. And I think that's the biggest BS. You know, but it could expand more because I think we're coming to it and then we jump.
yeah.
You know.
Well, I think you are bringing even more interesting dynamics to the notion of breath. And I love how you connect it again with the notion of rhythm and pulse. Because I remember one of the greatest teachers I had been bothering him for years to learn this song by A.B. Lincoln called Through the Years. And there was Babu Begim Selegu. So I would go to his home and he would just like somehow dismiss the whole piano story and take me to watch a movie. And I would be like, man, I need to. He would hear me play the first couple of bars. And this one time he said this, he said, man, I think there is a way in which you need to breathe, to play ballads, just as a practice. Every time you have to play a ballad, it has a lot to do with how you are breathing. But the notion of breath, of course, I was invoking it here in relation to the George Floyd story that troubled me quite a lot, the image of that moment and this inability to breathe and vocalizing that inability. And to see someone just like staring and not even caring about what was happening. For me, it suggested that there is an understanding about how the Black body refuses the very moment of death. And of course, for me, it links to cosmological nuances about what Barbara Mosse proposes and as an ontologic nature of being, which says, you know, we're going into these cycles and umoya, this notion of umoya. And it's funny because the same word in isiZulu for umoya is for breath, but it's also for spirit. So in seeing that footage, I was seeing how this understanding is so encoded in those police that they are now making an attempt to kill something else. When the body is already, you know, the body is dead. There is an attempt to kill something deeper, is to kill your very understanding of your own immortalness. In that moment of death, to code this idea that I'm killing you. So that was the thing about, you know, this idea again of displacement, this homelessness in the US. I mean, we can think about recently what happened in Kansas as well, when I was on tour. And this whole metaphor of a door that opens destruction versus, you know, a door in pre-colonial African senses that is always open. So, and a young person looking for a home. I mean, this is symbolic to a home and being reminded again in this moment that you are homeless. So breath was in relation to, yeah.
No more questions. I just want to say that. Sorry. So I want to just say that when Dr. Ngulunga asked me to conceptualize something around this space becoming a creative space and engaging with music. And then we came with this Jaya's music encounter series. It was pretty obvious that the inaugural session of this has to be by Dr. Nduduzo Makati.
Wow.
And I think you set the bar. It really set the bar. We couldn't have chosen any other person other than. That's why we were able to wait for you when we nearly did it about a month ago.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for that. But don't go yet. I wanted to say that. Yes.
Why music? Why not 18?
Another time for me. So next week is the second installment. Darius Brubeck will be here, right here, next week on the 26th at 3 o'clock, I think. And he's already arrived with his wife from England. They are quite grown-ups. They're no longer about Darius. I don't know what you call it. They will be here. And the good news now is that we did say we're going to finish at 7. But before I tell you that, Duduzo, you wanted to be the first person to have a copy and to, you said to Chris, what do you want? not photograph, to critique, to review.
I said it with you, right?
Yeah, to review. Here is the book for you. It's, let me just read for you what I wrote here. It says, Dr. Nduduzo Makatini, as a decolonial scholar that you are, I know you will find this an interesting read. The story of our people is now written in black and white. The weather has just announced me that more wine is arrived. And we do have some eats.
But then I guess for Sasi for was land over.
Oksasa Ikogo at Untitled Basement in Bramfontein, that's where we're gonna finish this whole story.
So it was in two
Yeah,
movements,
it was two.
because I've been proposing this notion of long sounds everywhere I go. It's like, you know, so long sounds is keep those dots
Yeah.
and bring them to intensify the vibrational depth of tomorrow's concept.